First off, I want to point out, we were talking about, if you recall, of things being getting more complex, and getting more complex through a kind in the secondary world of specialization. Not talking about the kind of specialization spoken of in biological areas of evolution, but in the specialization such as work becomes more and more specialized. I want you to consider this a beautiful place to look at this again, that from all sorts of basic rational views, to hear the words specialized or specialization and complexity, if I gave any sort of hint, me or anyone gave any sort of hint along with that, you could immediately consider them, or you could take the suggestion, the hint, that they are in some way opposed. I mean, it's easy enough to take even the definitions, much less the connotation of specialization and then complexity, and look at them as being opposed, such as if your job, the example we were using last time, if you had a job that entailed like 10 different duties in an office, the company grows, and they change your job from what it was general manager to start with, general office manager, and now you're general office manager / external correspondence. And so you would have now less duties, or it was more specialized. That part of what you were had been doing was split up, and somebody else was hired to do part of what you were doing. You can follow this, can't you? That you could say, I didn't want to, but I'll go ahead and say, in case it's making any of you get dizzy, that the business just got so big that you had more work than you could do, according to somebody. And so they split it up. So from one view, can you see right quick, your job has become more specialized. It has become, in a sense, more simplistic. Part of your duties are now taken over by somebody else. So, you individually have become more specialized, your activities. But you understand, on a broader scale, things have become there in that office more complex. And it is not a matter that simplicity or specialization is the opposite of complexity. I repeat one more time, it could easily be said so, and I could stand here and argue it if you can't do it yourself already, that they are the opposite. I mean, just rational. There's nothing mystical about it. Just from all sorts of views inherent in that example. If we didn't look at it another way, you could say, well, they are the opposite. They may not be antonyms, but they are certainly the opposite. Because the individual is not, his duties in this office have not become more complex, they have become less complex. And you can say, all right, he's specialized now. But the specialization entails inherently a simplicity, which is an anonym for complexity. It's not so, though. It's just a great example of the physical characteristics, don't say limitations, of the human intellect operating on polarized fuel in a three-dimensional world. Because they are not the opposite. Specialization and complexity are not the object. In that the former, to wrap it up to get us going, but they're not the opposite in that the former in the individual assures that the latter exists in the collective. That didn't wrap it up. Specialization. Remember, we're talking about man's unique secondary world. Specialization is not the opposite of complexity, in that the former in the individual assures the latter in the group, in the collective. It is a perhaps trickier way of looking at the fact that life grows by becoming more complex, and life becomes more complex at our level thanks to the efforts of man. And it is not through man's physical or somatic changes, whatever they might be. It is through this. And this changes how? Through, well, technically speaking, through yammering. Speech. Well, all of this that we were talking about last time, and that to just try and jog your memory. All of this still is a continuing reflection of the fact that life, in becoming more complex, through man becoming more complex, that as man is doing this, becoming more complex and more civilized from his own view. What is taking place is increasingly that man must not only act, which you've got to act at the primary level to live, that man must not only act, but he must concurrently and increasingly talk about what his acts may mean, which is the basis, almost singularly, of what is generally referred to as civilization. I'm not going to stop and get on that, but we've hit it from all kinds of directions. That you can say that there is no civilization without talk, but you can also say, as you should, that there is no such thing as talk or the secondary world without it growing from the primary world, and there would be nothing to talk about unless there were primary acts. And so what do men talk about? Well, when it starts, as soon as the bud comes up, as soon as a secondary plant begins to grow from a primary soil, the first thing it does, it's got nowhere else to look. The first thing that the tree does is talk about the dirt. But as the tree becomes civilized and gets higher, it not only talks about the dirt, where it came from, it begins to talk about its own limbs. It begins to talk about what kind of tree I am. I have grown much faster than my contemporaries. Yeah, I'll tell you the kind of oak I am. That it starts off, it is a blossoming it is a background of all these great drawings that some of you may have seen that arose from, or it's attributed to different factions within Buddhism, of drawing the universe. That takes people sitting down with a little pen and a magnifying glass and 30 years to spend drawing this complex thing that just gets more and more involved, and they claim that there's some great message in there. Can be, except consider what I'm telling you, the complexity of a tree starting out, and you are a tree, humanity is a tree, a plant. It is a secondary manifestation growing from the soil, the primary world. That not only it talks about that, which you could say is, that would be the first day after Adam and Eve. The first day they talked about, wow, if they were talking and you could do this just at the primary level, is they talked about, boy, I sure do like your privates. I sure do like the difference between me and you. I sure do like the way this food tastes. I sure do like the weather today. That was good maybe the first day. By the second day, they're no longer talking just about the primary world. That has to go by the way very quickly. And I say quickly, if you want to look at cartoon evolution, it could be thousands of years, but still quickly. They have to then begin to talk about talk. It starts out, and they talk about the primary world. That is, they start out talking about their acts. But then increasingly, they have to talk about what their acts may mean, which ends up, operationally, being, they talk about talk. Do you understand? You start out talking about, I thought it was plain enough. Did you really think that? That a little tree, a little plant, at that point out, I meant this symbolically. That the plant, the first thing, if a plant, a little plant that just gets its little head up above the dirt, and if it's going to talk, what's the first thing? And I say the first thing, you do understand it's the only thing. The first day, the little plant atom looks around, what can it talk about? There's only one thing to talk about, and that's where it came from. That is, its primary world. That is, the dirt. But within the next day, sometime, the plant looks around, and if we were ordinary people, you could say, the plant gets tired of it. All the plants finally, how much can you talk about dirt? How much can you talk about where you came from? I mean, I know that Akron is a fascinating place, but if you and everyone else talked about Akron, for thousands of years, you finally kind of get, I guess, right things to say. So what do you start doing? The day after you talk about the dirt, the plants begin to talk about themselves. They begin to tell what kind of plants they are, as they're supposed to. It is it's not the purpose, of course, of me bringing this up, but this is, again, another way of looking at the heart of all the necessary arguments of life, the verbal, intellectual, philosophical, religious, all of the tug-of-wars that go on, which is a transfer of energy and is necessary, but looked at another way, instead of life making ordinary people believe that this should be cured, that something is wrong, instead of it being a flow of energy, an interchange of energy, I was just going to point out from another subversive view that's of no consequence to ordinary people, that you could see this as another, quote, reason why people don't understand each other, if that was a problem, which it's not, but if it were, because they're not supposed to. There's nothing to understand. Well, I don't mean that in some $2.95 paperback book version of Zen Buddhism for those from Akron. Well, I'll get a little more specific in a minute. Maybe I can give you a better example. When I say there's nothing to understand, that's not some great, just forget it all, because, of course, there is something to understand, or this would be in fun. But insofar as there being something to understand at the ordinary level, you're back to the great gag, effort of people, know thyself. That's why it's funny. Because at that level, there's nothing to know, unless you want to say, well, I know that, well, you fill it in. We've spent enough time on that. It is no longer sufficient. Just simply see this so we can press on a bit further. Maybe that much. Is at least see that as you must act, you must eat, you must screw, collectively speaking. The man down here got frightened when I said that. You are a man. Well, no. You must continue to do those primary things. You must continue to act. You must even act at the secondary level. That is, assuming that you are not filthy rich, and if you are, how come I haven't heard from you? If you're not filthy rich, you have to work. So that is, you have to act, you have to get up and go do things. So everyone is still acting. But notice, acting is no longer enough. In just the most basic sense, it is no longer anyone who's hearing this, anyone who's got a TV or a cassette machine was playing this back, no one is anymore simply a hunter or a gatherer, unless you happen to be in that band. So whatever you're doing, it is not enough. You cannot even be a modern day equivalent, let us say, if there was such a thing. You cannot even be a bricklayer, a mud boy to a bricklayer, and just go out and mud boy, because you at least got to show up. And Buford or whoever's in charge says, told you 6:45. You got to say, car wouldn't start. You can't just go out and hunt, gather, or mud boy. Even if you're acting at what would, from a civilized or sophisticated view, perhaps be at a very low level. And I'm just using city terminology. That is certainly not my opinion. And I'm saying that you're a mud boy as opposed to, a chemical engineer. Aren't they considered to be, well, I would have to ask you. That no matter what your job is, even if it's down to the level that you get paid at the end of the week, and you were paid for your muscles, more or less, of just being a mud boy, just keeping the bricklayer in supplies, you still, nowadays, you cannot operate on that basis. And the individual is of no importance, even if we could come up with some other far-fetched example that somebody almost could do it. It is collectively, of course. That always means collectively. It means that, and sometimes that used to be a secret signal. I'm getting off the track, but it was it Christ King College? Anyway, it was around 1710 or so, with people like George Philip Telemann and some of them. It was, I don't know all the details, but it was something like a high five that they did back then. It was like, like the Baroque period will go on forever, and they're maybe some of you know the other details. It was something like that. It is that, collectively speaking, acts are no longer sufficient, even if your job consisted primarily of acts, of laying brick, driving a truck, and etc. It doesn't matter that humanity, the life of secondary man on this planet, cannot operate on the basis of acts. It must have acts, but it must have concurrent and ever-increasing comments on the acts. That speech must become more complex. How much more complex than driving a truck How much more complex can it get than it is now? My guess is, just to save time, not very. How much more complex can it be to dig a ditch than it is now? If we suddenly could jump our minds into the 21st century and they were still needing ditch diggers, how much more complex would the art of digging a ditch be? My guess is not very. But you would have people, since we now have those running organized collective religions in suits, fancy hairdos, and with doctorate degrees, then there's no reason to suspect that maybe 50 years from now there will not be people digging ditches in suits with nice haircuts with some kind of degree. Perhaps maybe still in theology, but in something. It will get more complex, but not the physical act of digging a ditch. Screwing will not get any more complex. Eating will not get any more complex. But notice, if you're civilized, you eat, and somebody who is less civilized, somebody living in a different evolutionary time zone, they're sitting down eating. The food may be slightly different, but that's not the point. They're getting basically the same kind of nutrition that you are if they're staying alive, whether they live on an isolated island somewhere in the Indian Ocean or whether you're living in downtown sophisticated Akron. The food is more or less the same. But what is different? And not just the preparation, all that, the secondary milieu of it, the whole environment. And the main environment is what? Yammer. To talk about it. To talk days before you're eating. The people on the little island, people in a different evolutionary time zone, they get hungry. And what little they talk, they may say something like, eat. But the more sophisticated, the more you live in the secondary world, it's not just eat. You may be talking about where you're going to eat a week from now. That's quite ordinary, quite common. It is, in fact, proof from a quite valid view of increased sophistication. It would be one of the operational or functional distinctions you could make between a bricklayer, a man with very little education, a man living, well, I won't be crude, a man who's moved up, who is now living in a trailer park. The difference between that and a man, a chemical engineer with a nice degree and a nice home, he and his wife may be sitting around and discussing where they will eat a week from now. Next Friday, they'll discuss, they'll look in the newspaper, they'll compare what they've heard about different restaurants. The complexity, they'll end up eating basically, taking in the same basic primary nutritions that the guy in the trailer park, him and his old lady, do when they go down to McDonald's. But it's just on the basis he turns around and says, hungry? She says, yeah. He said, come on. And they get in the truck and they drive down to McDonald's. And he says, 1 or 2? And she says, so he says 7 Big Macs. And they get the same basic nutrition, but notice there is an increased complexity in how. And it's not just the food. You can say, well, wait a minute, there's a difference between a damn old Big Mac, some kind of cheap fast food, and the fine meal that the chemical engineer and his wife are having over here at this French restaurant. And there is, but do you understand that's not the basis? There would not be a difference of the food or at this fancy French restaurant if people couldn't talk. The basic distinction is talk, because that is the basic distinction in being civilized and not being civilized. And of course, anybody that's not civilized can't see the distinction because they couldn't hear it. And ordinary people who can hear it are already so civilized, they go, well, I guess the sense makes sense, but what the hell are you talking about? Go to the icebox. We'll wait on you. We ain't going to wait on them. I just want to get rid of them. Another thing I wanted to throw in for a second, if you recall last time I was pointing out a kind of specialization going on of how talk operates even on the basis of what seems to be history. What seems to be the importance of life is becoming more and more a perception intellectually that has not yet been measured. It's not important, but I'm just pointing out this already happening. It's been happening for thousands of years, but is increasing right now. Of the perception of what's going on in life is more and more on a secondary level. That people are, in fact, more interested. It's not this or that. It's not what I'm saying is absolutely true right now, all across the board or in any particular way, but all of you, if you can hear it, you can hear it, that there is an increasing, even in your lifetime, preponderance of quite ordinary, sophisticated, the mainstream of life, looks at history, current events, you might want to call it, but that looks at history on a more and more personalized secondary level, such as they would like to know the gossip about what does Gorbachev's wife look like without makeup in the morning, as opposed to what's going to happen if Georgia or Azerbaijan actually sets up their own army and splits away from the USSR totally. And it's not right or wrong. It's not attacking the people magazine generation. It is simply that the secondary world is becoming more and more important. It's happened just in months. We're staying here October 1999, and of course it doesn't take me to point out. You've got ordinary commentators pointing out that it's miraculous. It's unbelievable, the changes that have happened between the East and the West in political conflicts. The breakup just overnight almost, the disintegration of the second most powerful country in the world, the USSR. That is not the way that intrigues people anymore. That seems astounding. And those who make a living with political commentaries and writings, of course, lay on this. But notice, the day after it happened, or the Germany becoming reunited, and who would have believed it? It just happened almost overnight. And it was making all the news, and people in the street were talking about it for how long? Oh, 2 or 3 days. Really? I know it's still in the paper, but notice in your own nervous system. You're a contemporary of it. It was like, if you were interested in such affairs, and to think, when you first heard, well, they just suddenly, East Germany just kind of gave up. Nobody really said anything, but it was like a secret dog whistle was blown. The guards left the Berlin Wall. It just like the whole thing, something unbelievable, just happened literally overnight. Wow! And they were dancing on the wall and throwing a big party, which, fine, but how long did that last? That particular view, that particular attitude. Hardly 24, 48 hours. After that, it is now more an interest at the People magazine level. That is, what seems to be great world events are increasingly on the basis of talk events. Well, it happened. Is that not astounding? Have you read the latest of what's happening in the arts? Have you read the latest of the kind of information they have found in the files over there in East Germany in their sports centers? Do you understand? The act, the physical act of the Berlin Wall falling, the physical act, which it is in a sense, of the USSR as an entity collapsing. The act itself, well, sure, it's just people, it's astounding. Within a few hours they're going, and without me continue to make up examples, because examples prove nothing. I'm just trying to get you to look in a certain way at your own nervous system, not at history. That the system is more and more, as life becomes more and more complex, and it does so through talk, remember, not through acts, is man's interest in what seems to be even current events, history. But current events is not just on the event is wow. But now the wow, instead of lasting 1,000 years, Homer, if he was alive today, he couldn't make a living. Well, not writing this crap that go, no offense, don't you Homer lovers write me. Writing these things that go on for, miles and miles and pages, if Homer went to get a job, they'd just take a look. Bring in whatever the manuscript or the original Odyssey or Iliad looked like, they'd immediately say, look, Homer, my man, you're going to have to get an editor. I wish I had time to read this, baby. I really do. But, we're putting out a magazine here. We're talking about, like 1,500 words. Now, go cut that thing down and bring it back. I like the concept, but bring it back when it's manageable, when somebody will pay attention to it. That is the human nervous system. Now, that is the progression of it. The more complex it gets out there, in a sense, the more specialized it becomes. Yeah, it is amazing that things are happening like that over there. How's it changed their music scene? Or who is this new guy that's threatening to become president? Somebody said that he used to play in a band. The complexity of life changing is more and more, if you can see it. As always, as you know, this is not any sort of organized attempt to put a new view on life, because life couldn't hear it. There's nothing to be said to ordinary people. There's no direct point to this. That's why this always seems so indirect, because there is no direct point to life once you see it. It is a continual unfolding. And it's to see that what is going on in life, in your life, and all the life around you, is of less and less consequence on what we've been calling the primary level, although I'll point out again, it's of supreme consequence at the primary level. Because at the primary level is not of supreme consequence to you individually, you're yesterday's news. You be dead. So it is of supreme consequence, right? Right. Now back to, it's of less and less consequence. Other than the fact it's of supreme consequence, but it's of less and less consequence, that won't get you anywhere. Being a bricklayer won't get you anywhere. Having the biggest muscles in the office, in the school where you are, in the chemistry department, you may be able to whip everybody's ass in the chemistry department. But you know that's not going to help you in your academic move upwards. The importance is more and more in the secondary world. Life is not going to grow without talk. Humanity is not going to grow without talk. Civilization does not happen without increasing talk. And without talk, I was going to try to give you a raffle on what we were talking about just then. Without talk, there is no such thing as history. None. Not academically, not theoretically, not in reality. There would be no paleontology, there would be no anthropology, there would be no history, even here, without talk. In the primary world, there is no history. You're either alive or you are history. But there is no history. Trees have no history. Dogs have no history. Only talk has history. Oh, I'm sorry for those of you that came back from the last box. Only man, only man has history. It's actually only talk has history. But man has talk, and therefore he thinks, yes, I have history. Which would be like a dog. It'd be like fleas being able to count, and dogs cannot. But if dogs should hear about this, those that had fleas would think, hell, I can count, because it has fleas, you see? Anyway, words have history. Man does not, but man has words, and so who's going to say, hey, man, you ain't got a history, all you got's fleas. The man says, what the hell are you talking about? Without talk, there would be no growth, there would be no history, because man would not be making any comment on what he has done. And that, boys and girls, is what history is. That is what history is out there. A comment on what I've done, that is what history is in here. Sometimes known by the academic phrase as, let me tell you what kind of guy I am. It's a comment on what you've done. Fascinating as hell, but it's history. I was going to move into, we're out of time, of how speech not only has become the fourth S, but has become the fourth M. But I don't guess we should try and start it with only 3.5 hours left on the clock. Let me wrap up by going where we started. And I said it was a beautiful view, another beautiful example. The idea, what would appear to be the immediate comparison between specialization and complexity. We periodically hit this, again almost as a drive-by shooting intellectually. But you should be able to do it yourself continually in life. It's not philosophical. It's not a rhetorical arm wrestling with human speech. But human speech is simply the bile put out by the organ instead of the liver. Not just playing with words, but you are surrounded by things that would appear to be verbally in opposition, not good and bad, right and wrong, and etc. But if you start using your own perception, there is a greater collection, a greater dichotomy, a greater division in life. And one way is to judge on the basis of speech and thought, which You can look at it as being the collective, that is the wisdom, the rationale, just what everybody in general believes, wherever you are. It's your local God, it's your local king, it's local reality. And then the possibility of some individual view. Not a matter to start with of I'm better, I see the light and everyone else is an idiot, that only I am correct and everyone else is wrong. It's not that. It's the difference between the neural revolution of dancing the revolution and doing the ordinary dance is that what you can see does not simply conflict with everything else. It agrees with it, it conflicts with it, and it's also that which everybody else has never even thought about. It is being able to take the three full measurements. It's being able to digest, to be aware of the fact that there are three forces. There's C, D, and E going on. The dance is not two people. It is not me dancing against my foes. It is not my ideas dancing against everybody else's ideas to see who can lead. There are three people on the floor. And when you see it, you can swallow it. You can digest it. And it's then that you can take on your own, whether you do it verbally or have to write it down or not, to see something such as life becoming more complex. Somebody surely said that sentence before I did. It's no big deal. Somebody said, yes, life is becoming more complex. And then somebody else, I'm sure, has said, did you realize that in contemporary life, it is more and more a matter of specialization? I'm sure somebody said that. I'm not at all sure there'd be no reason for somebody somewhere to say, wait a minute, both of these views cannot be correct. Something is amiss here. You can do it for yourself. It is not necessary that somebody have done that. It's for you to realize that somebody could. That is, my ordinary perception. My old intelligence could go, wait a minute. At the time I've heard both of these ideas expressed, there was no doubt. It wasn't a debate. But I understood that, yes, that's true. Life is becoming more complex. Some months later, I heard somebody point out, life is becoming more and more an inescapable matter of specialization. I, for myself, can see that if I were looking at it from an ordinary view, these are two opposing views and they both cannot be correct. And it's not a matter, all right, they can't both be correct. But then again, you got to say, hey, they both can be correct. And then there's something else. And one way to look at it is what I was trying to get you to see, if the sentence got too convoluted when I started, if you try and, if it helps at all, to look at it on the basis of the collective, that is, what appears to be the part of the equation of out there, everybody else. Not right or wrong, but just everybody else, and then I, in the equation of I plus not I equals it all. I, and then the collective. To take the example of specialization and complexity, increasing complexity and increasing specialization, which, from a quite valid view, you could make the argument that they are opposed. But to see that it's not a matter that things are either more specialized or that things are specialized or are complex but can't be both. It is not that. But it's a matter to see, in this instance, that it is a matter of the former specialization being true in the individual, which you can take as you as the example, assuring that what appeared to be from another view the opposite, that is complexity, it assures that that does happen in the not I, in the collective. The ultimate opposition, which we're already out, but the ultimate opposition from one view is between I and the collective. And I'm using I for everyone. And it's not true, of course, for everyone. That's what the revolution is about. A few people, not that they're arguing with it, but that they, for whatever reason, were wired up in such a way that they can think in a way that doesn't belie out here, that is not some kind of blind, useless, feckless revolution against the city, the establishment. It's being able to eat the establishment. I mean, to eat it and then swallow it. And not get indigestion. And not swallow it like, well, I taught them a lesson. Bye.